Today I'm going to tell you about the origins of the Scottish investment trust industry and the role that Dundee had to play in this. The subject formed part of my PhD thesis, where I found a strong connection between the jute industry in Dundee and the development of the American West, mainly through finance generated from the investment trust industry. An investment trust holds shares or other capital in what is considered to be a reliable investment fund. The capital is then invested in a portfolio of professionally chosen stocks in order to make a profit. The primary advantage of using an investment trust is that it is an attractive method of diversification of funds, minimising risk by spreading investments across a number of holdings. Another advantage of using an investment trust is that it provides access to a professionally managed portfolio of investments, attractive to investors with varying levels of financial experience or amounts of funds. The early trusts also came with a high fixed rate of interest or dividend, where holders could be promised at least 6% per year, in some cases 8%, typically paid in half-yearly instalments. Now, once this had all been paid and all expenses accounted for, the surplus profits were put into a reserve fund. And the reserve fund is an important distinguishing feature of the investment trust. It was used to guarantee the rate of interest, particularly at times of low or no profit. It also meant that an investment trust could avoid taxation on any financial accumulation if it created a capital reserve. Well-organised and successful trusts also offered low administration costs and, most importantly, skilled management. The first Scottish investment trust was registered in Dundee in 1873. The appropriately named First Scottish American Investment Trust was founded by Robert Fleming, the namesake of the British Investment Bank and a native of Dundee. Fleming had the support of many local jute and linen merchants and manufacturers who acted as directors and some quite large investors in the trusts. And the principle was that a pooled investment vehicle modelled on the London-based Foreign and Colonial Government Trust, where individuals of moderate means could gain access to a diversified range of stocks, minimising risk. Now, during the 1870s, there emerged 4 Scottish trusts, 3 in Dundee and 1 in Edinburgh, all of which were concerned with directing their capital to the United States. Estimates suggest that as much as £4.25 million had been directed from these Scottish trusts into the United States in that decade alone. And even when I say decade, I'm really meaning from the beginning in 1873 just through to 1879. A large proportion of that capital was derived from the investments of small shareholders, mostly from the local surrounding areas of Dundee and Edinburgh. Dundee and Edinburgh overwhelmingly dominated the sector for the entire period by housing the largest proportion of Scottish trusts. Certainly by the end of the 19th century, the two cities were the only areas in Scotland to have trusts registered within their boundaries. It wasn't until the 20th century that investment trusts began to be registered in Aberdeen or Glasgow. So why did this all start in Dundee? There are 2 reasons. First, there were already strong trade relations between Dundee and America through the supply of jute. Production volumes in Dundee always peaked during and immediately following times of conflict. Wartime created a market for low-value jute products, and the American Civil War was the peak of the demand for the Dundee jute industry. Among other products, the Federal Army needed great quantities of canvas, tents, sandbags, sailcloth and soldiers' uniforms, for which the inexpensive coarse linen was perfectly suited. But they also supplied the Confederate soldiers of the South, where historically they had strong direct links supplying items like cotton bagging and slaves' clothing. Now, historians have always been aware that American bonds were offered as a source of payment for jute supplies, but have so far only recognised this as a method of temporary funding following the Civil War boom. I found that this carried on far beyond the war years. In a letter to agents Kidder Peabody & Co. of Boston in January 1871, whose client could not pay their debts to the Cox brothers manufacturers, Thomas Cox requested that they find reliable American securities yielding about 7% as an alternative method of payment. 2 years later, when payment was readily available, Cox brothers were still requesting securities instead of monetary payments. In January 1873, they volunteered that they had been waiting in anticipation that the premium on gold would have risen. It did not, so they would yield a better return if invested. They trusted Kidder Peabody's good opinion in the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railroad bonds, and providing that they sat at around 7%, they authorised them to go ahead with the transaction. Trusting that, failing this, you can recommend something else. By July 1873, Cox brothers preferred to take securities instead of gold, since the rate of 3% was less than they should like. Cox then inquired whether Messrs. Brown Brothers & Co. of New York could offer any safe railway bonds bearing fully 7% in gold. The Cox brothers were not alone in making these investments. Most of the jute and linen merchants were building similar investment portfolios. And by 1879, Cox brothers had accumulated a portfolio worth £75,000 of American railroad and mortgage bonds. The second reason the trust industry originated in Dundee was that the flourishing jute industry had created a wealthy middle class, and these people needed a vehicle in which they could invest their savings. You didn't have a pension in these days, and given bank deposits generated relatively little interest and were viewed as unsafe, this was the time around the failure of the Glasgow Bank, this left a void. So at the time, a young Robert Fleming was working as a clerk for Baxter Brothers, the large linen manufacturers in Dundee. Edward Baxter, being Dundee's previous American consul, was an expert in American investment and trained Fleming in investment management. Fleming realised that with an absence of secure banks, there was both an opportunity for investment and a requirement for a vehicle for savings for local people. The growing middle class in Scotland required some place to be able to enter investment at a time when many of the local industry was simply not an option. Private firms required far too large a deposit for most to afford, and a single investment like that resulted in such a high liability. So at a time coupled with low confidence in bank deposits and international investment was reserved just really for the very wealthy, there was a lack of opportunity for savings and investments. The investment trust resolved this, offering a diverse portfolio of stocks where investors could purchase a share for as little as £10, and these were generally spread by industry and geography to spread risk and maximise returns. Many trusts were formed as a response to credit crises to provide finance to industries that were desperate for credit. Robert Fleming used the Depression in 1873 to launch the first Scottish American Investment Trust in Dundee, and also the Scottish American Investment Trust Company in Edinburgh, along with William Menzies, a local lawyer. Now, while he did not invent the concept of the investment trust, he played a strategic role in the development and operation of the organisation of many of them, not just in Scotland, but also in London, and together his trusts, which ran to over 70 in number, made a significant contribution to the amount of capital raised and directed overseas. This is perhaps why he embodies the most notable figure in the trust's history and is often associated as the father of investment trusts. Fleming knew that the chosen vehicle for investment had to be the very epitome of trustworthiness, security, prudence, and reliability to attract the attention of proposed investors and convince them to entrust their money in the scheme. Fleming had a lot of work to do. Not only did he need to find the support of several directors, men of high standing who would act as trustees and have confidence in the plan, Fleming convinced 4 of the best men in town to back the trust and act as directors. The launch of the first Scottish American was so successful, the British Linen Bank was flooded with applications on the first day that they decided to withdraw the prospectus and print a new one, doubling the capital issue to 300,000. As a result, the second Scottish American emerged just 7 months later, and the third in 1875. So the popularity would suggest that there was a definite need for such a vehicle. So who were the people entrusting their hard-earned savings into an unknown vehicle and investing them in the risky emerging markets of North America at the time? Evidence suggests that rather than the investors coming from the law and finance professions, as was previously assumed, the people investing in the first Scottish American Investment Trust Company, as indeed most of the Dundee Trust companies, they were closely associated either directly or indirectly with the local textile production. A large proportion of them were jute merchants, but there were overseers, mill managers, factory inspectors and clerks. There was also other middle-class professions like optometrists. There were bakers, there were fish curers, there were teachers, there were clergymen. There were also a large number of women and children. By 1914, there were 22 trusts registered in Scotland that managed to raise a total of £25 million. This capital was invested in a range of securities, mostly directed towards ventures in America. So by way of conclusion, my thesis found that the origins of the Scottish investment trust industry had textile manufacturing at its roots, and that Dundee merchants and manufacturers were highly influential in this process, acting as active directors and investors. The jute trade and outstanding remittances following the Civil War were key to this, and there is no doubt that credit for this industry goes to Robert Fleming, who was clearly instrumental in driving forward a number of companies, not just in Dundee but across Scotland and London. Fleming had created a vehicle that made it possible for these people to pool their monies together to own shares in a diversified portfolio of international stocks and securities. The investor gained a professionally managed service at a low cost, and this revolutionised stock ownership, allowing the middle class to enter into international investment. And some of these early trusts have enjoyed tremendous success, not least Saints, one of the first established, but also Scottish Mortgage, the Scottish Investment Trust and the Alliance Trust, who have all survived well over a century of investing.